the New York City Democratic primary, because that happens Tuesday of this week. In fact, this will probably be the last time you hear me until after we find out who wins that primary. And because the bottom line is this, here you have two. I think if the progressive movement could have picked who they wanted to be their face in this mayor's race, they would not have picked Zohran Mamdani. And certainly if the center left or the pro-business or the establishment wing of the Democratic Party were looking for an avatar in a primary, the last person they would have chosen is Andrew Cuomo. But here they have Cuomo and Mamdani. I will tell you this, the panic among the establishment crowd, if Mamdani wins this primary, because he will be the Democratic Party nominee. Now, look, Andy Cuomo's still going to be on the ballot. Eric Adams, who's the current mayor, is going to be on the ballot. There's all sorts of different ballot lines they are. By the way, if Mamdani loses the primary, he's also, I think it's Working Families Party that he'll be on, but he's going to have another ballot line that he's on. So it's possible we have a 4 or 5-way general election. If you've ever dreamed of that, I have. I think we're kind of a 4-party system in reality. Well, we could have quite the chaos on our hands. Andrew Cuomo, Eric Adams, Carlo Sliwa, who's the founder of the Guardian Angels, and Curtis Sliwa. Sorry, I was blanking on his name. I wanted to call him Carlos Sliwa. Sorry about that. Curtis Sliwa, founder of the Guardian Angels, is a Republican nominee. So it could be a wild general election. But this primary, what New York City Democrats do, who finishes first, who finishes second. Yes, it's a ranked choice voting, so we may not have the final tally until Thursday or Friday this week. Maybe, who knows if it's something else. But just who's the leading vote getter? Who wins the most first choice votes? It will tell us something about where the energy is inside the Democratic Party. So look, there's a lot. That's why you think, what the heck is Jim Clyburn, a South Carolina Democratic congressman, weighing in on the New York City mayor's race? Well, he's part of the establishment, right? He weighed in with Cuomo. Like I said, Michael Bloomberg was no Cuomo fan, but he's writing millions of dollars of checks. Mamdani's candidacy scares the living daylights out of Democrats who think the party's brand is already seen as too liberal. We'll see who's right. I'm old enough to remember when a lot of establishment Republicans thought MAGA and the far right of the Republican Party was a losing strategy for them to win elections. 10 years later, I'm writing essays that say Donald Trump's the most influential president since FDR. So I'm not going to sit here and assume either side is correct in this one. I'm certainly one that believes that the party does have a brand problem, and that I do think they ideologically, if you're seen too far to the left, that's a bigger problem these days than if you're seen as too far to the right. So in general, it's pretty clear there's a brand problem, at least with the middle of the electorate. When you're asking the middle to hold their nose, this most recent election, they chose the far right over what they perceived to be as a party that was too liberal. So something to keep in mind and a reason to watch that race.
Ask Chuck.
This one comes from Alexander S. from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hey, staying on my theme of June 17th. Has nothing to do with what I just talked to you about earlier in the pod, but he said, today, June 17th, I was looking at polling on Real Clear Politics. An Insider Advantage poll shows that Trump's approval is at 54%, 44% disapproval, while Pew's approval is at 41% and 58%. As someone who wants to see the majority of the country send politicians a clear message, which one should I believe? How can two relatively respected polling companies have such diverging results on the same day? Thanks. Well, I'm not going to agree with you that these are two relatively well-respected polling companies. Insider Advantage has had lots of question marks about. They seem to have a reputation of massaging their numbers, always having it makes things a little too good for the right side of the aisle, which is, this will be why Real Clear and Nate Silver will say, well, this is why you've got to, you're going to have a house effect with some partisan pollsters. You're going to have a house effect with others who maybe lean too much to the left. That's why you should average them all together. My problem is I don't like this type of trying to analyze polling that way, because when you combine it all, look, there are good polls and there are bad polls, right? Just like there are good journalistic outlets and there are bad journalistic outlets. I will tell you this. Here's how I feel about trying to take two disparate pieces of data and merging them and thinking you're going to get better data. If you think good data plus bad data equals better data, then ask me this. Does mixing a filet mignon with dog shit make the dog shit taste like filet mignon, or will it make everything taste like shit? Right? You put a, point is, I can put polls in a blender and I'm going to get shittier numbers, and you're just not going to. I could put a filet mignon and dog manure in there, and it's all going to taste like dog manure. The bad data poisons everything. So look, uh, sometimes polls just have house effects. And if they have house effects that are consistent, then I would tell you, look for trend lines. Um, the Trump constituency has been among the hardest to track in many ways. There's a lot of distrust with the media in general. So if you say you're a media sponsored poll, sometimes people won't participate. So you've got to be careful of a lot of those things. So I always look at trend lines, and if you'll see if the trend lines match, maybe the numbers are off, focus, one poll in isolation, even from a good pollster, can be wrong. So you want to look at any poll's trend line. That's why I don't like to mix these things. I like Pew, and I like Pew over time. They do some really quality work. They care, and it's very transparent. You'll have other polling firms that'll put out a top line number, but they won't tell you, is this part of a larger questionnaire? Is this all of this, especially the partisan polls or this insider advantage stuff, which is a little questionable. I'm not a big fan of these IVR polls, which are known as the interactive polls, where literally press a button if you like this, press a button if you like that. There's been some inconsistency there. But look, there are polls that are good. Look, I'm not a big fan of YouGov, and you see a lot of their data. So, I have a couple of go-to polls. I trust my old NBC News pollsters. I'm not a big, NBC News is now working with SurveyMonkey. I don't think it's as good as the work that public opinion research and heart research strategies and heart research do. And so I like those numbers. I like the Wall Street Journal's bipartisan team of pollsters. I like Fox's bipartisan team of pollsters. Pew is a good one. So there are good pollsters and there are bad pollsters. And so that's why I ignore the poll compendium averages. I think the poll averages will mislead more often than they lead. And if you look at all these approval polls, you could sort of you see that there's not many polls that have Trump right side up. So you got to ask yourself, is this an outlier? And if you have an outlier result, I'm glad when you report it. Let's see what it looks like in the next poll. So, and I've been doing this long enough that you sit there and you're like, well, that doesn't look right. So then you sort of look, sometimes you open up the hood of these polls if they'll give you enough information. And that's my beef with YouGov. They don't do that. That's my beef with Insider Advantage. They're just a little too, they obscure a little too much of their methodology. Pew doesn't do that. The NBC bipartisan pollsters don't do that. Neither do the journals. So, how a poll is presented, how transparent are the pollsters, all of those things factor into whether you should find a poll believable or not. And I think I have a big beef with my friends at Real Clear. And like I said, I love my man, Carl Cannon, know those guys. I knew them going back to my old hotline days and love their entrepreneurial spirit. But they kind of treat all polls flat, and sort of don't. And there's just not enough. The other problem we have is too few media companies are conducting polls anymore. So you can have a handful of pollsters sort of manipulate averages too. They're all trying to correct for it, but I just think it's Nate Silver does it slightly differently. I've had this conversation. I told him I'm not a big fan of it. And he goes, he tries to give a weighting, he at least tries to limit how much of the dog manure ends up in the blender, if you will, from bad data. But he is somebody, as a data scientist, that thinks even bad data has something to teach you. And I don't disagree fully, but I certainly wouldn't combine it with what I know is good data.